Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, today's guest has a bachelor's degree in social science. He has a master's degree in nutrition, dietetics, and food science. He has his PhD from UCLA in, I believe, community health and health psychology. He's published several peer-reviewed articles in the space of food addictions and related topics. He's even worked as a personal trainer. Dr. David Wiss, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have a chat with you today.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. I would like us, Dr. Wiss, to start from the basics. Okay, so when we say cocaine addiction, right? We're talking specifically about a single substance. We're talking about cocaine. When we say, I don't know, cigarette addiction, right? We're talking about the nicotine. When we say food addiction, what on earth are we talking about? There's a whole world of foods out there. What exactly are we talking about? Why don't we just clarify that for our audience?
Thank you. Such an important question. I think food addiction has been in a lot of debate, and there's been a lot of controversy because of the definitions. And I think those of us in the scientific community have really decided that we need to define terms much better in order to move this area of research further. So I believe that the better term is ultra-processed food addiction. I think that discerning between food, which is a very broad category, as you specified, and ultra-processed food, which can be determined using the NOVA classification, is very helpful in figuring out what it is we're talking about when we discuss addictive-like processes related to food.
Okay, well, that makes it simpler. So let's talk about processed food addictions. From your experience, do people develop these addictions later in life, or do they really start very early on in their childhood and then they find out later in life that this is just out of control?
Yeah, such a good question. And I think there's probably a mix of all of it. I would assume that genetic vulnerability from parental history of addiction or alcoholism can be a risk factor for people having dysfunctional relationships with food. And as we know, the relationship with food is imprinted early in life. So children get access to ultra-processed foods and are using them for reducing negative affect or quote unquote feeling better. Sometimes people use the term emotional eating. And I think if that pattern is imprinted very early on, it's likely to leave a legacy that will stick with people throughout their lifespan. Not to say that it can't be overcome or reversed or just become a thing of the past. And then I do think that some people develop it later on in life. The data on food addiction, ultra-processed food addiction, suggests that the prevalence is higher in adults than it is in children, which would point to the fact that it's like other addictions in the fact that it develops slowly over time with chronic exposure. So, addictions like cocaine and nicotine, as you mentioned, usually start to happen in the teen years, in the early 20s. That's like the common time. And it takes time for the addiction to really get cemented in the neural pathways. And I think that's probably true for food as well. And the last thing I'll say about it, if someone has another addiction, like if they have cocaine addiction or alcohol addiction, and then they stop, there's a higher likelihood that they'll cross addict into ultra processed food. And if someone has significant trauma, PTSD symptoms, it's also very likely that they could develop addiction-like eating patterns as a result of the trauma.
I was going to ask about the PTSD because you talk about that. You're passionate about the PTSD. So we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. In my mind, it was always something associated with war, because
Right.
obviously, retired army veterans tend to suffer from PTSD. And in fact, I've known personally a few people who suffer PTSD. What is PTSD and how does it trigger food addiction specifically?
I think we use the term PTSD a lot because it's the term that's in the DSM-5. It's the clinically recognized term, but there are a much wider range of potential trauma that can exist for someone. So we use the term trauma, which doesn't have an actual clinical definition, and that can include other forms of trauma like complex trauma, which isn't associated with a single event. Generally, PTSD is linked to an event like going to war, getting in a bad car accident, abuse, etc. Whereas there are other forms of trauma that aren't just linked to a single event, but the way that people experience life, perhaps in relational health. Maybe they had a very dysfunctional relationship with someone, and it wasn't one thing that was traumatizing, but the legacy of multiple exposures. Sometimes I use the term micro traumas that can really have an impact. But, because PTSD is the clinically recognized term, that's where a lot of the research happens. And of course, we have a lot of, as you mentioned, research on people that have been to war and experienced, significant trauma in the face of crises. And yeah, it is important to discern between the two. Sometimes when I talk about trauma, we just use the term PTSD symptoms, because oftentimes someone doesn't have specifically exactly PTSD, but they're a trauma survivor and they're experiencing a lot of PTSD symptoms like hypervigilance to threat, difficulties with sleep, anxiety, etc. And so, yeah, that is a known risk factor for disordered eating. There's been a lot of work linking PTSD to eating disorders. And then, yeah, in the last few years, some of us have really posed the question, is the relationship between PTSD and eating disorders mediated by ultra-processed food addiction? And that's a question that we're, really trying to figure out.
Or is it the other way around?
Exactly.
That's such a fascinating question. So where are we as far as science is concerned with this specific question? It's a fascinating question. What's the starting factor? Where does it all begin?
Yeah, I think a lot of the trauma research focuses on the first 18 years of life because there are differences between people that have trauma in developmental processes versus people that have trauma in their 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. Now, of course, people that have a lot of early life trauma are more susceptible to later life trauma. But the biggest body of research is on adverse childhood experiences, which are, multiple forms of adversity experienced either in the household or in the community. The traditional ACE measure just looked at childhood maltreatment and household dysfunction among the parents. But now we're looking at adversity that can happen in the schools, in the community, et cetera. So the most research is on the first 18 years of life and how that can actually change someone's biology. There was a lot of research showing that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, increase the risk for drug addiction and alcohol. The risk is sometimes fourfold, fivefold, triple, quadruple the likelihood of having an addiction to an illicit substance following childhood adversity. And then from there, it was like, okay, what are the mechanisms? What are the actual biological mechanisms? How does trauma impact the brain? How does it affect the immune system? Increase inflammation? How does that affect the brain? The HPA axis? There's a lot of potential epigenetic changes. So there's about 7 pathways linking trauma to addictions, trauma early in life. And if you look at similarities between substance use disorders and ultra-processed food addiction, you can sort of just map it right on and say, if this increases the risk for addictions, why wouldn't it increase for other addictions as well? So yeah, there are studies on early life trauma and ultra-processed food addiction, but we definitely need more. I've actually been collecting data in my practice now for about 2 years, and I'm getting ready to analyze it, looking at ACEs and food addiction. And I really want to adjust for dieting behavior and eating disorder behavior, because the argument against food addiction is that a lot of people have these symptoms because they've been dieting too hard and they have disordered eating, body dissatisfaction. So what we're trying to do now is tease out the association between trauma and food addiction, tease out the contribution from body image and dieting that comes from the more classic eating disorder psychopathology.
Let's talk about the difference then. Eating disorders and food addictions, obviously they're separate things. So how are they different? Is, for example, anorexia, can we say it's also addiction to little food, if you like, as
Sure.
little as possible? But is it an addiction, or is it something completely different in clinical to sort of science?
So that argument has been made, and I am in favor of it, that someone with, for example, anorexia nervosa could become addicted to starvation or addicted to restriction, as people call it. We know that individuals with bulimia nervosa can become addicted to the purge. So it's not just the binge and the food that's very rewarding. It can also be the act of purging, which is very self-soothing, particularly with the vagus nerve, and particularly when there's a lot of trauma. So the argument that the eating disorder spectrum can contain a lot of addiction-like processes has been made and has some scientific support. However, it does seem that the eating disorder community and the addiction community are very split and very separate. And I think that there's a lot of overlap between them that isn't currently being discussed. It seems like there are these two different schools of thought, and you either on one side or the other, and that's the state of the field. And I've been working really hard to try to educate the food addiction community about eating disorders, and to educate the eating disorder community about food addiction, and say it doesn't have to be these very separate and distinct ideologies. There's actually a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of tension, at least from my perspective. There's a lot of tension about this conversation, because in my assessment, the eating disorder community does not seem to like the concept of addiction-like eating, because the argument is that it promotes more restriction and more dieting, which can in turn cause problems for some people.
If they come to you though for help, you're not very fond of restriction. You've talked about that, right? You don't necessarily want to eliminate any food groups or tell people that is something you are not ever going to eat because it will have repercussions. Tell us about how you approach restriction.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's why I like the term ultra-processed food addiction, because if someone has ultra-processed food addiction, it does make sense to me that someone would want to reduce their exposure to ultra-processed foods, right? That makes sense to me, right? And I would endorse that if it was clinically appropriate. But I get nervous when people want to cut out all the other kind of food groups. Not to say that it can't work for people. I mean, I know that there's people that do well on keto. I know that that's true, right? And they don't eat.
I'm one. As a type 1 diabetic, that's the only way I can achieve normal HbA1c. I've tried the other way for 40 years. It didn't work.
Yeah, so. I believe it, and I support it. And in some cases, you can't argue against it, right? But what I've seen is that a lot of people with ultra-processed food addiction, they really might want to cut out grains and cut out fruit because they're more interested in losing weight, which, you can't fault people for wanting that, right? I'm not, blaming anyone for wanting to lose weight, but the consequence that I've seen, and I'd love to get your input on this because I know you're in the keto community, is that for some people, not for all people, once you cut out grains and fruit for too long, or for a long period of time, it almost feels like they can never safely eat them again, right? Like one piece of mango and they're going to binge on mango, or a little bit of rice and they're binging on rice. And now, as an eating disorder clinician, those are things that make me concerned, right? Like, I would never want to promote a way of eating that would lead someone to binge on kidney beans or barley. You know what I'm saying? Because those aren't ultra processed foods. And so that's the nuance that I try to bring to the ultra processed food addiction conversation. I am all for people moving away from ultra processed foods and eating whole foods. But when you've been eating just like a protein, vegetable, high fat diet, and now you're scared to eat a nut, it's a little concerning for me. I get a little worried. That's all. What are your thoughts?
It all comes down, I think, in my experience. I work with a lot of type 1 diabetics. We support each other because, unfortunately, we're not getting the required support from our clinicians. Not all of us anyway. So we're a global community. I have a Facebook group. We basically support each other on the phone. We just give each other advice about how to reduce insulin. This shouldn't be our job, but we've taken it upon the community to support each other.
Good.
There are a few of us who have adverse reaction when they go on intermittent fasting, for example. I mean, it comes to me. It comes so naturally. I'm not hungry. I don't eat, and I'm perfectly fine for another 24 hours. It doesn't always work with everyone. I've noticed that firsthand. And usually these are the people who have some kind of addictive or unhealthy relationship with food specifically. So even if they don't eat for 18 hours and they feel all great, hey, I fasted today, I did it, and they go on carb binging themselves on carbs, not steak, carbs. Which obviously, for type 1s, they're going to suffer for another 24, 48 hours before their sugars normalize again.
Yes.
Unfortunately for these people, I mean, from what I know, is that fasting is just a big no-go area. Do not fast. Just eat normal 3 meals at set times. And you talk about routine set times, and we're going to have a question about that as well. So just eat normal food, stop snacking, stop the processed stuff, and just see how you feel, because your blood sugars are going to react to that. Even that simple change of removing the snacks and removing the cookies and the donuts, you're going to see a difference. Even if you are eating a piece of fruit with your lunch, you're still going to see a difference in your blood sugars. So yeah, I think, I mean, for most of us though, I would say probably 70% of us in the group, we fast without any adverse reactions. Some of us do extended fast as well. I mean, I do it. I don't crave anything. I think, people say, oh, you're in the minority. I'm not. I would say I'm in probably the 50%, and the other 50% struggle. So this is why I'm very passionate about food addiction issues or addictive behavior towards foods, because I see it all around me. Why don't you tell us about the importance, because you've talked about that in some of your videos, of having a set routine, a habit, if you like, of eating times, sleeping times. Even bowel movement. You've talked about bowel movements.
Before I answer that, I want to respond to your comment, which I think is so important. You know, there's approaches out there that can work for a majority or for half. And then there's going to be the group, the 20%, 30%, 40% that don't respond well to fasting or keto or those things. And I've always been interested in that group. I'm interested in the outliers. I'm interested in the people that have different neurochemistry. And so I suspect that the reason why one person would be able to fast without difficulties and the other person would be, losing their cool, dysregulated emotions and binging their brains out is because of different neurochemistry. In other words, different serotonin and different dopamine We do know that carbohydrates have a serotonin effect, and some people will do better from not having any stimulation there and bringing their sort of serotonin down. And then other people will need a certain amount of activity in the serotonin system. And the same is true for dopamine. Individuals with a history of addiction are going to have different baseline levels of dopamine, right? So if someone is really, really low at baseline in their, dopamine neurotransmission, and then you do a dopamine fast, right, where you're not eating, you're not doing any stimulation, like if it gets too low, the reptilian brain is going to show up and say, this is a threat to our survival. We need some activity here. And that's when people experience loss of control eating. And so we don't really have great data on this. This is more of a theory that I'm saying, is like, how do differences in people's serotonin system and dopamine system point to different needs for different nutrition interventions? But I think that's a really, really great area of future research. And so for someone that doesn't do well with fasting and keto, it might be because of their brain chemistry. And in these cases, someone would do much better with a very consistent signal of food, and this is also true for people that have trauma. For someone that has PTSD or a lot of early life adversity, it is characterized by feelings of unsafety and inconsistency, right? So if someone has a nervous system that's always detecting threats, it's very possible that no food could come as a threat, or erratic or unpredictable food patterns can register as being threatening to survival. So for someone that has a lot of trauma and a lot of addiction history and disordered eating, I make the argument that the best thing to do is to get consistent with food and like pick meal timing strategies. First figure out how many times per day you want to eat, and then roughly pick the times. And it doesn't have to be, exact, but if someone were to say, I'm going to eat at 8, 12, 3:30, and 7, right? That could be a very good strategy, give or take an hour, on both sides. I do think that consistent message has a lot of benefits. For some people, it's blood sugar stabilization. As you know, everyone's probably got some differences there. The other one is just a consistent flow of nutrients. The body can only absorb so many nutrients at one time, right? So if you give it like a protein 4 times a day, could be better than getting it all in one meal, right? And that's certainly true for, a lot of athletic performance studies. And then it's just the message of consistency to the nervous system. You're safe. There aren't scarcity. There aren't shortages. Everything is coming, right? So yeah, some person could really benefit from getting a shortage message. Nope, there's nothing coming. We're good. Turn off, turn off. But for someone else, they need to get the message of there's carbohydrates, protein, and fat coming. You're safe. You don't need to go into any crises. Your neurochemistry has support, right? Your gut bacteria is working. Your enzymes are working. Everything's working. We're just smooth sailing. We're having consistent patterns with food, with sleep, with movement, bowel habits, water, getting some sunlight. And for some people, that is the key to success with nutritional recovery.
Wow, that's fascinating. It really is, that consistency. I noticed that not with respect to sleep or stress necessarily, or even bowel movement. I hadn't even considered that, but I see it around me that consistency helps with regulation of blood sugars and also mood. So that's related. Now you explained it.
Yes.
So it's fascinating. Okay. I want to go back. Earlier on, we mentioned, or you mentioned, adverse childhood experiences known as ACEs. Can you give us some examples of what sorts of adverse reaction, is it experiences or reaction experiences we're talking about, childhood ACEs? What could they be? Because we're talking about the mini or the micro traumas. We're not talking about one major event in a child's life, but we're talking about a series of minor traumas that add up to adverse childhood experience, right?
So the most well-known ones fall under the category of childhood maltreatment, which would include childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, and then of course there's like psychological abuse, right? And then, there's multiple forms of neglect. It could be emotional neglect, not giving the child attention and love. And it could be physical neglect, not providing clean clothes, food, and consistency, right? If a baby grows up without consistent patterns of safety, right, that can be a very serious problem that can be imprinted in their biology and have major prediction for mental health issues and physical health issues later on in life. And then there's a category of what we call household dysfunction, which looks at the environment in the home growing up. So for example, if a family member is using drugs or alcohol, if there is domestic violence in the home, if there is someone who is mentally ill, if someone goes to prison or goes to jail, if there is parental separation or divorce, right? So those are the sort of two main categories of adverse childhood experiences in the household, is childhood maltreatment and then household dysfunction. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they've expanded the concept of adverse childhood experiences to go beyond the household and just start looking at adversity in the community. So for example, there could be children that grow up in really good households where there isn't any abuse or neglect. The parents are happily married, but there is a lot of adversity in the school or in the community coming home from school. So this is what we call community level ACEs, which occur outside of the home. And this includes bullying, exposure to violence, discrimination, particularly based on, race or ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And someone could have a lot of adversity in the community and none at home, but there's also cases where children have a lot of adversity at home, but tend to have a lot of support in the community. Maybe they have other relatives that take care of them because their parents aren't doing so great. Maybe they built a social network and they really love being at school. And so sometimes it's difficult in research to tease out, what's the more, contributing ACE, because they tend to cluster and co-occur. People that have one ACE tend to have multiple ACEs. So the research really says it's not usually the single ACE that predicts a health outcome, but usually when there's an accumulation of multiple ACEs present, that people have high predictability for disordered eating. That's my area of interest. We did a systematic review to show those that had multiple ACEs had a 46% increase in quote unquote obesity in adulthood. So, that could be a food addiction process. It could be a lot of other things as well. But the original ACE study from 1998 has been cited now over 10,000 times. It's like one of the most cited papers in one of them, top something. I don't know how high up there, but it's one of the most cited papers in history.
Okay, so all these traumas could lead to food addiction. Where does depression come into this? Because these traumas may as well just lead to, they do, in some people, lead to mental health issues, right? Depression being one of them. And is there any link between depression and then processed food addiction? Does one lead to the other?
Yes, such a good question. And these are the challenges with doing research on early life, because you're recalling exposures in the first 18 years and then figuring out like what was the trajectory of symptom onset, right? Like, did someone develop food addiction and then become depressed, or did they have depression that led to food addiction? And this is, what we call the bidirectionality. Both pathways exist. I know that the risk of being depressed or having depressive symptoms is 2 to 4 times following early life adversity. So those that have ACEs are like 2 to 4 times more likely to become depressed or have depressive symptoms in their adulthood. I do suspect that a lot of that could be mediated by food addiction, because food, ultra processed food, is highly available everywhere. And I think it is a very early symptom of trauma, for a lot of people. And we know, and there's a lot of data to support that people that eat more ultra processed food are more likely to become depressed, right? So I would like to see more research on that pathway: early life trauma, food addiction to depression. And of course, some people have depressive symptoms for a wide range of reasons. It could be more, psychological in nature. They ascribe a lot of meaning to their early life adversity, have family dysfunction that persists over the lifespan. If someone's not in touch with their family in their adulthood, these are other contributors to depression. But from the biological standpoint, the early life adversity to the ultra processed foods to the depressive symptoms is definitely a pathway that I'm interested in. But like I said, the other pathway is also very, very common, which is that someone is traumatized, very depressed, and then they turn to ultra processed foods to make the depressive symptoms sort of go away in the short term. So it would be difficult to tease that out unless we did longitudinal research where we followed people prospectively rather than looked at it retrospectively. When you look at it in the past, it's going to be hard to know which one is the actual pathway. There are statistical methods to investigate that, but the real way to figure that out is to follow people for, a few decades. And that's just hard to do. It's expensive. It's hard research to do. And I wish that I could do it.
And it's not been done yet. Nothing like that has been done.
Not with food addiction. We know they've done it with depression, right? Mm-hmm. People that eat more ultra processed foods are more likely to develop depression. That's been shown.
Just a small experience from my own community, and the group of people who are not able to control their blood sugars because they go into sort of binge eating every couple of days. I know that they come back to me and they say, I've been bad. I've really been bad. I was doing so well for a good 42 hours, normal blood sugars. Then I ruined it all and I'm feeling absolutely horrible. And in fact, obviously, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a physician, I can't diagnose them. I don't know, and I don't even ask if they are diagnosed as being clinically depressed. But that feeling of total failure and sadness for what they've done, and that they had no control over it. They couldn't control their behavior. They didn't knowingly ruin their blood sugars, but they just could not control their behavior. And then they feel so unhappy and sad. Mm-hmm. In one case, I had someone saying, I'm feeling suicidal right now. Mm-hmm. They're crying her heart out. And so that's my experience with sort of depression and processed food, so binge eating.
Yeah. A lot of people would use that as the argument against doing extreme diets for some people. Because if, some people will be able to thrive and get their blood sugar right where they need it to be and feel like $1 million, feel amazing. And then the next person is going to have persistent feelings of failure and guilt and shame. And that creates a spiral and a cycle. And right, that would be the reason why some people would be much better off just being consistent with food. And I have a theory that a lot of times that reaction that people have from, rebound eating, sometimes it has to do with their blood sugar. Sometimes it has to do with dopamine, right? Sometimes it has to do with this thing we're talking about, food addiction. But in other cases, it might also be because some people who do lose weight, if you're much lower than your highest ever body weight, some people's bodies are okay with that. Some people's bodies are okay being less than they used to be. And this is coming from my experience working with people for 10 years now. There are some bodies that are not okay in a suppressed weight. And that if someone's like 60 pounds under what they used to be, their body's going to be fighting to gain that weight back. And that's something we're thinking about. And it's difficult news for some people. Some people can live in a body that's smaller than it used to be. And other people, when they try to do that, it's just the pathway towards weight gain and eating is so persistent and the body does not give up.
That's interesting. And this is why we have to emphasize health, mental health, physical health, more than weight.
Yes.
Look, so yeah, I always focus on health. We mentioned consistent bowel movements. For anyone out there who's listening to this and has now realized the importance of consistency in your life with your nutrition and eating times and even bowel movements, but they don't have it. So what do you recommend for them? So how do people have bowel movement? How do we, My first question is actually, specifically about bowel health, microbiome. How do we make sure our gut is healthy and we're having consistent bowel movements?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about gut health and how to, optimize one's microbiota. For example, for some person who's been eating a ton of processed carbohydrates, going on to a more lower carb ketogenic thing might actually show some improvements in a microbiome. Whereas for most people, it's the carbohydrates and the fiber that actually improve the gut microbiome, right? So that's where it's really, really tricky. And we need to discern between carbohydrates that are refined versus, whole grain. They seem to make a really big difference. But the one area where scientists seem to agree is that we want a lot of bacterial diversity. And the best way to achieve that is by eating prebiotics, which are fibers. There's a lot of prebiotic foods out there that people mention. You hear like Jerusalem artichokes and chicory root and all these foods that no one can find at the grocery store. So I just tell people, just try to eat more fiber, more soluble fiber, specifically from things like, oats and chia seeds. These things do have scientific support for improving gut bacteria. And so, yeah, I think that fiber is important. I know that there are people that do well with lower amounts of fiber. I do know that. But in general, the data suggests that, individuals don't get enough fiber. So focusing on getting more through fruits and vegetables and beans, nuts, seeds does seem to be, at least high on my list of clinical priorities.
I mean, if someone's diet is full of the processed foods, then they're not getting any fiber. They're not getting enough. Definitely,
That's right.
They're not getting enough. You mentioned fermented vegetables as well, like sauerkraut and others. So what's the benefit of them?
Yeah, they actually have the live microbes on them. So a lot of people take probiotics, and I'm a fan of taking probiotics. I've been taking probiotics for over 10 years. I recommend them to a lot of my patients and clients. But yeah, fermented foods have the live beneficial bacteria on them. And so some people don't like the idea of taking supplements. A lot of supplements can be expensive. And, if you can get it from food, that seems to be a more sustainable approach. I do come across people that really just can't stand the taste of the fermented vegetables, the kimchi and the sauerkraut. So, if someone has aversions there and can work through them and learn how to incorporate small amounts of that food daily on a plate, that's a huge win. But otherwise, probiotics can be helpful. But when I talk to people about gut health, I'm really trying to emphasize that it's not one of these things that's going to do the trick. We need to do all of these things. We need to do the beans, the chia seeds, the fermented foods, the probiotics, the fibers, and maybe some supplements as well.
Mm-hmm. So which supplements come in handy? What supplements do you recommend? Are we talking about the sort of the vitamins D, C, etc., or are we talking about minerals specifically like zinc and
yeah, zinc is definitely good for gut health. It really depends. Even the term gut health is broad, right? Like it depends if we're talking about someone that has some intestinal permeability or possible quote unquote leaky gut versus someone that has been on, proton pump inhibitors, PPIs, and might have some imbalances due to that. For example, they might need to take some B12 because that gets low with proton pump inhibitors, or the dysbiosis from low fiber intakes, right? So it would depend. If it's dysbiosis from low fiber, they all cluster and co-occur, by the way. I'm not saying that those things don't occur together. They oftentimes do, but it is wise to specify when making supplement recommendations. I listed some of the ones that are good for gut bacteria. When it comes to intestinal permeability, there are some blends out there from some of the companies that I use that will include some glutamine, usually some zinc. And then, there's a few compounds that are known to be soothing to the mucosal lining and reduce, some of the acid symptoms. The stomach acid thing is very tricky too, because we've always used to think that when someone had, GERD, reflux, right? Burning, that it was because of too much stomach acid. And now more recently, we're starting to think about that as being a symptom of too little stomach acid. So, and that's a tricky thing to tease out. Sometimes it is helpful to take some hydrochloric acid attached to some beta-ene. And there's just a lot that would need to be assessed before making broad gut recommendations, but there are definitely supplements that can be very, very helpful. And we know that once you sort of heal the gut, you start with the gut, a lot of the other things seem to fall into place.
Dr. Wiss, when people come to your clinic, what are some of the steps you take with them? Obviously, you have to screen them, right? Well, general health screening is important, but also, what if people think they have some kind of food addiction, but you don't think that they do? Have you experienced that? So what's the process that you go through with your patients when they first come to you?
Yeah, I do see that a lot. So once we chat and they set up an appointment, I have a lot of forms that I will ask someone to fill out. And these are more mental health screeners. So I'm looking for food addiction, eating disorder symptoms. I'm looking for PTSD symptoms. I'm looking at adverse childhood experiences. I'm looking at some dietary stuff, how often they eat from certain foods, et cetera. And of course, I'm very interested in someone's weight history, their lowest ever, their highest. And I use all this data in conjunction with my intake interview, where I really learn everything I feel like I need to know about someone to be able to offer some feedback, right? And I do ultra processed food addiction treatment with people when I feel that it's clinically appropriate. When I feel like this is the right fit for someone, I will endorse someone going along that path. So if someone says, listen, I really don't want to eat any sugar and I really want to eat more, whole foods, and I don't see them at high risk for eating disorder behaviors, they're not like necessarily engaging in compensation or aggressive and persistent weight loss, that might feel like a good treatment trajectory that I'll get on board with. But because of my training and expertise in eating disorders, I sometimes do come across people who really want to believe that it's food addiction. because they have a lot of food addiction symptoms and because they really just want to focus on cutting out foods, restricting, losing weight, and eating less. And when that's the case, I really feel like I have a duty as an eating disorder clinician and researcher and as a healthcare professional to do what I think would be the best for that person long term. So if someone has tried dieting and dieting and dieting, trying to lose weight, and they always gain it back, they always binge, it might suggest that a different treatment approach could be helpful. And what I mean by that is like, stop trying so hard to lose weight and to diet and start making peace with food, doing some body image work. And, this is challenging work that not everyone wants to do, to be able to say, you know what, I've spent my whole life trying to lose these 10 pounds and I always gain it back. At what point, or 100 pounds, right? It could be any discrepancy. At what point do I decide that I'm going to try my best to experience life in the moment, be present, start to enjoy food again, get back in the kitchen, make, like healthful, joyful meals, eat them mindfully, and really stop assuming that I should be able to lose weight and fix myself, right? So that's very important work that I also do. And it's hard to know what's going to be true for someone. And I don't always know on the first meeting. Sometimes it takes a little while of doing some work together. For example, sometimes people try to be a little bit more inclusive with their food and then learn like, this really doesn't work for me. It doesn't feel right. I need to get more deliberate and be on more of a plan. And then there's a lot of people that have just been on plans their whole life, weighing and measuring their food. And then they just need something new. They need to be able to drop out of that really rigid approach and to be a little bit more open-minded and curious about food. So I do both forms of treatment. And I don't really know anyone else that does that. I know people that do like either one or the other. They do like inclusive eating, or they do sort of like more intentional, like, rigid type eating. I know people that do those different things. I pride myself on the fact that I not only do both, but I work at the intersection. So someone that has an eating disorder, that has gut issues, can come see me and get some treatment for both. Someone that has food addiction and depression could come, right, get some nutritional treatment for both. And I really try to bring in the philosophies from different schools of thought and different camps so that we can really meet people where they're at in terms of their physical health, their mental health, and their social context.
A couple of quick questions before we wrap this up. The importance of having a support network around you, importance of having a community that supports you.
Yes.
If everyone around you in your household is going to the local, I don't know, burger, whatever place for fast food every evening, you're not going to be motivated to just go to the kitchen and cook just for yourself. Your That's children right. aren't eating with you, your spouses aren't eating with you. So how important is that support network and the community?
Yeah, I rarely see people thrive in getting into food recovery unless they can build some sort of a network. I have seen people be successful, but generally, feeling a part of a community is incredibly important for any kind of mental health. And being around like-minded people makes a huge difference, whether it be sharing tips for success, as you guys do in your group, or if it really just is about feeling seen and feeling heard. That's important too. When you feel all alone and you're trying to do something that no one else gets, it's difficult. And so, yeah, being able to form a community, and that's why a lot of people go to 12-step stuff for food. And, I support that and I endorse that. But once again, sometimes that can get, a bit much. But yeah, in general, and this was the findings from, our recent paper with Jen Unwin, is that, yeah, group education matters. It's important. And social support. Yeah.
My other question was about the importance of actually getting into the kitchen rediscovering real foods and that experience, is it helpful? Does it help with food addiction? People, does it help people who suffer food addictions?
I think it's critical, and it goes beyond just ingredients. I think a lot of people that have had dysfunctional relationships with food feel a lot of food negativity because they assign negative value to the food. The food's the problem. Food is causing me distress. And then it's very common that these are people that don't like cooking. I don't enjoy cooking, right? But what if food was the solution and you could get into the kitchen and get really excited and fall in love with making food again and celebrating it, playing music? I think that the healing that comes as a result of learning how to do hands-on nutrition goes way beyond just like, oh, getting the right types of oils and less salt and all that. I think that the value of it really is on a spiritual plane, that allows people to feel connected to the universe, because food represents our most profound interaction with nature daily, right? And it is so important for us to connect to food, connect to the plants, and to feel like we aren't just visitors here on planet Earth, that we are nature. We're here to be a part of the community of people and plants and the entire ecosystem. And when we can thrive in the ecosystem, it can allow for some deep healing to occur.
What a beautiful note to finish our conversation with. Dr. Wist, how can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Absolutely. My clinical practice has a website, which is nutritioninrecovery.com. I am on social media at Dr. David Wiss, pretty active on Instagram, and would love to hear from you. And then I have an app that is about to launch in the new year. It's called Wise Mind Nutrition. Wise Mind Nutrition is the website, wisemindnutrition.com. You can find me on Instagram at Wise Mind Nutrition and YouTube at Wise Mind Nutrition. That's the YouTube channel. And join the mailing list, and you'll get a freebie, which is 5 tips you can use to improve your mental health with nutrition. And you'll get an email as soon as the app comes out, which is going to be in a few weeks. And I can't wait.
What a fascinating conversation this was. I can't thank you enough for accepting my invitation. My audience will appreciate all your insights, and I will release the video in 2 weeks.
Great. Send me a link.
I will. Thank you so much for your time today. Bye for now.